When grief-stricken Duke Alexander Harrowmoor arrived at his father's abandoned Scottish estate, he expected nothing but empty rooms and painful memories. The mist-shrouded highlands promised solitude for a man who had lost everything that mattered. But on his second morning, something impossible happened. Through the morning fog, he glimpsed a figure moving with the grace of wind through heather, a wild girl, no more than 16, running alongside a pack of wolves as if she belonged among them. When their eyes met across the glen, she vanished like smoke into the ancient pines. The locals whispered of the ghost child who had survived alone in these mountains for years, but Alexander knew she was real. Her story would change everything he believed about his family, his past, and the very nature of civilization itself. But what secret had driven this child into the wilderness? And why did his family's coat of arms terrify her so? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Range Rover's engine ticked and cooled in the courtyard of Harrowmoor Estate as Alexander sat behind the wheel, staring at the imposing stone facade that had haunted his childhood dreams. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's funeral. 3 weeks of well-meaning relatives offering condolences and business associates discussing the necessary arrangements for a man suddenly alone at 52. He had fled London, not in search of healing, but in search of nothing at all. The October wind carried the scent of wet heather and ancient peat as he stepped onto the gravel drive. His father's hunting lodge rose before him like a medieval fortress, its grey stones darkened by decades of highland weather. Ivy crawled up the walls in thick tendrils, and several windows on the upper floors had lost their glass to storms and neglect. The Duke had visited this place only twice as a child, both times leaving with the uncomfortable feeling that the stones themselves were watching him. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of amber light filtering through grimy windows. The great hall stretched before him, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that could have roasted an entire stag. Mounted deer heads gazed down with glassy eyes, their antlers casting twisted shadows on the oak-panelled walls. Alexander's footsteps echoed in the emptiness as he moved through rooms that smelled of old leather and forgotten fires. In his father's study, he found the man's presence still lingering like pipe smoke. The heavy oak desk sat positioned to overlook the glen, its surface covered with a film of dust that revealed the rectangular outline where books and papers had once rested. Alexander ran his fingers along the desk's edge, remembering his father as a distant figure who spoke more easily to his hunting dogs than to his only son. The leather chair behind the desk creaked as Alexander settled into it, and something crinkled beneath the seat cushion. He reached down and extracted a slim, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore his father's initials in fading gold leaf. Private observations. Alexander opened it to a random page and found his father's precise handwriting documenting what appeared to be research notes rather than hunting records. Day 47. Subject shows remarkable adaptation to isolation protocols. Cognitive development appears unimpaired despite removal from standard educational environment. Note increased aggression toward authority figures. Recommend adjusted approach. Alexander frowned and flipped to another entry. Day 73. Breakthrough in communication barrier. Subject responds to non-verbal cues with extraordinary sensitivity. Dr. Whitmore suggests this may be evidence of enhanced survival instincts rather than developmental regression. The bond with animal subjects remains concerning to the committee. The pages rustled as Alexander searched for context, for some explanation of what his father had been studying in this remote place. Most entries were clinical, detached, but occasionally his father's true voice emerged in the margins. God forgive me. What have we done to this child? Alexander closed the journal and walked to the window. The late afternoon sun painted the glen in shades of gold and rust, and somewhere in those rolling hills was the girl he had glimpsed that morning. His father's journal suggested experiments, subjects, and committees. The word child appeared repeatedly, always in contexts that made Alexander's stomach tighten with unease. As darkness settled over the estate, Alexander built his first fire in the great hearth, using logs that had waited years for flame. The crackling wood filled the silence, but could not dispel the growing certainty that his father's hunting lodge had been something else entirely. The journal held dozens of entries spanning what appeared to be several years, all documenting the progress of an unnamed subject who seemed to exist on the boundaries between human and wild. Alexander poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from a bottle he found in his father's cabinet and settled into the leather chair with the journal. Outside, the highland wind moaned through the eaves, and somewhere in that vast darkness he sensed eyes watching the warm glow of his windows. The girl was out there, and tomorrow he would begin to understand why she had looked at his family's signet ring with such unmistakable terror. Alexander woke before dawn to the sound of ravens cawing in the ancient oaks that bordered the estate. The whiskey had done little to quiet his mind, and his father's journal lay open beside him, where he had fallen asleep in the leather chair. The fire had died to embers, leaving the great hall cold and grey in the pre-dawn light. He dressed in sturdy boots and a wool coat, then stepped out into the crisp morning air. The mist hung low over the glen, transforming familiar shapes into ghostly phantoms. Alexander had decided during his restless night that he would search methodically for signs of the girl, treating it like a reconnaissance mission rather than a hunt. If she truly lived wild in these hills, she would leave traces. The search began at the tree line, where he had seen her disappear. Almost immediately, he found what he was looking for. A footprint in the soft earth near a stream, small and bare, with toes that seemed to grip the ground like claws. Beside it, the unmistakable paw prints of wolves. Alexander knelt and studied the tracks, noting how they moved together, neither following nor leading, but traveling as equals. He followed the trail upstream, moving slowly and stopping frequently to listen. The forest was alive with sounds that spoke of undisturbed wilderness, the distant call of red deer, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But there was something else, a quality of watchfulness that made the hair on his neck stand up. Near a bend in the stream, caught on a thorny bush, he found a scrap of fabric. It had once been blue, perhaps part of a dress, but weather and time had faded it to the color of winter sky. The material was rough, institutional in its plainness, and far too small for a grown woman. Alexander carefully freed it from the thorns and held it up to the light. How long had a child been living wild in these mountains? A branch snapped behind him. Alexander turned slowly, his heart hammering, but saw only empty forest. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified, as if the trees themselves had eyes. He pocketed the fabric scrap and continued upstream, his senses heightened by the certainty that he was no longer alone. The stream led to a clearing where the remains of an old stone cottage mouldered beneath a canopy of birch trees. The roof had collapsed decades ago, but the walls still stood waist-high, overgrown with moss and wild roses. Alexander approached carefully, noting how the vegetation had been recently disturbed. Someone had been here. Inside the ruins, he found evidence of habitation, a circle of stones that had contained many fires, bones picked clean and arranged in neat piles, and shallow depressions in the earth that might have served as sleeping places. But it was what he found, tucked into a crevice in the stone wall, that made his breath catch. A small carving, clearly made by human hands, depicted a wolf with a child riding on its back. The craftsmanship was primitive but expressive, created by someone with an artist's eye, but no formal training. The wood was dark with age and handling, worn smooth by countless touches. Alexander turned it over in his hands, feeling the love and patience that had gone into its creation. A low growl rumbled from the tree line. Alexander looked up to see a massive grey wolf watching him from perhaps 30 yards away. The animal showed no fear, only a calm assessment that seemed almost human in its intelligence. Behind the wolf, barely visible in the dappled shadows, stood a slight figure. The girl. She was smaller than he had thought. Dressed in what appeared to be layers of salvaged clothing, bound together with strips of leather and vine. Her hair hung in wild tangles around a face that might have been pretty, if not for the wariness that hardened her features. She studied Alexander with the same calculating gaze as her wolf companion, and when her eyes fell on the wooden carving in his hands, she took a half-step forward. Alexander slowly placed the carving on the stone wall between them and backed away several steps. The girl watched him retreat, then moved forward with fluid grace that seemed to flow rather than walk. She retrieved her carving, clutching it protectively against her chest, and for a moment their eyes met across the ruins. In that instant, Alexander saw not a wild creature, but a frightened child, who had learned to survive by becoming something other than human. Then she turned and melted back into the forest, leaving only the memory of haunted eyes and the echo of her wolf's departing howl. The village of Glenmoor huddled in the valley, like a collection of grey stones scattered by some ancient giant. Alexander drove the winding road down from the estate, his mind still processing the morning's encounter. The girl's eyes haunted him, holding depths of knowledge that no child should possess. He needed answers, and the village was the only source of human contact for miles. The Crown and Anchor pub occupied the village's heart, its weathered sign creaking in the afternoon wind. Inside, the low-beamed ceiling and stone walls created an atmosphere of comfortable gloom, broken only by the warm glow of a peat fire. Alexander ordered a pint and struck up conversation with the barkeeper, a weathered man named Duncan MacLeod, whose family had tended this establishment for 5 generations. "Aye, you'd be the Duke's son," Duncan said, polishing a glass with practiced efficiency. "Sorry for your loss, though I understand the old Duke wasn't much for mixing with the locals." Alexander sipped his beer and chose his words carefully. "I'm settling his affairs. Been hearing stories about someone living wild up in the hills. Thought it might be poachers." Duncan's expression shifted, and he glanced toward the other patrons. 3 elderly men sat playing dominoes in the corner, their conversation dying as they sensed a change in the room's atmosphere. "Not poachers," Duncan said quietly. "Something else entirely. Been going on for years now, ever since—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "Since when?" Alexander pressed gently. One of the domino players, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks, looked up from his game. "Since the night they brought her back down from your father's place, screaming like a banshee." "That would be, 8 years past now." Duncan shot the man a warning look, but the damage was done. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "Brought who down?" The old man's companions tried to hush him, but he waved them off. "The wee lass." Morag Sinclair was her name. Social services had placed her with some research program your father was running. Supposed to be helping troubled children, they said. Alexander's stomach clenched. He remembered the clinical tone of his father's journal entries, the references to subjects and protocols. What happened to her? "Nobody knows for certain," Duncan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But when they carried her out of that place, she wouldn't let any adult near her, bit and clawed like a wild animal. They tried putting her in care, but she kept escaping, always heading back to the hills." The domino player leaned forward, his eyes bright with the pleasure of sharing a well-worn tale. "My grandson saw her once, 3 summers back. Said she was running with the wolves like she was one of them, hair all wild, dressed in rags, moving through the forest like she could talk to the trees themselves." Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew the newspaper clipping he had found tucked in his father's journal that morning. The yellowed paper was dated 8 years earlier, and the headline read, "Local girl missing from estate research program." Below was a school photograph of a young girl with large, serious eyes and carefully braided hair. Even in the faded newsprint, Alexander could see the resemblance to the wild creature he had encountered. "Morag Sinclair," he said, showing the clipping to Duncan. This is her? Duncan nodded grimly. Poor lass. Her parents died in a car crash when she was 6. No other family, so she ended up in the system. Your father's program was supposed to be progressive therapy for traumatized children. Used animals and nature as healing tools, they said, but something went wrong. Something went very wrong indeed. The authorities investigated, but your father had connections. Important friends in Edinburgh and London. The whole thing got swept under the rug, and the program was quietly shut down. Alexander folded the clipping carefully and returned it to his pocket. The girl's real name was Morag, and she had been 8 years old when whatever happened at his father's estate had driven her into the wilderness. For 8 years, she had survived alone in the highlands, becoming something that existed between human and wild. Does anyone ever try to help her? Alexander asked. Duncan shook his head. She won't come near the village. Sometimes we leave food at the forest edge, but she's as likely to flee as take it. After all these years, I think most folks have given up hoping she can be brought back. The old domino player leaned back in his chair. Some things, once they're broken, can't be fixed. Maybe it's kinder to let sleeping wolves lie. Alexander finished his beer in silence, weighing the man's words against the image of frightened eyes that had met his across the ruined cottage. Morag Sinclair had been failed by every adult who should have protected her, including his own father. But she was still alive, still surviving, and that meant there was still hope for healing. He left the pub with more questions than answers. But at least now he had a name for the ghost child who haunted the highlands. Tomorrow he would begin the long process of earning Morag's trust. Alexander returned to the ruined cottage the next morning, carrying a canvas bag filled with simple offerings: bread, cheese, apples, and a thermos of warm soup. He had spent the night reading more of his father's journal, piecing together fragments of Morag's story from clinical observations that grew increasingly troubled as the entries progressed. The forest felt different in the early light, less watchful but somehow expectant. Alexander approached the stone ruins slowly, making no effort to conceal his presence. If Morag was nearby, she would know he was coming long before he arrived. He placed the food on the flat stone where he had found her carving the day before, then retreated to sit on a fallen log about 20 yards away. The morning was still and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass and his breath forming small clouds in the air. Alexander settled in to wait, understanding instinctively that patience would be more important than any words he might speak. An hour passed before the first wolf appeared, the same grey male that had watched him yesterday. The animal emerged from the tree line with careful steps, its yellow eyes fixed on Alexander as it approached the food. Behind it, moving like a shadow-given form, came Morag. She looked even smaller in daylight, her slight frame lost in layers of mismatched clothing that she had clearly scavenged and adapted over the years. A man's woolen sweater hung nearly to her knees, belted with what appeared to be braided grass. Her feet were bare despite the cold, and Alexander noticed they were heavily calloused, more like paws than human extremities. Morag watched him while the wolf investigated the offerings, sniffing each item carefully before stepping back to report its findings through some communication Alexander could not perceive. She moved forward then, keeping the wolf between herself and the strange man who had invaded her territory. Her hands, when she reached for the bread, were quick and precise, tearing off pieces to share with her companion. Alexander noted how she checked each morsel carefully, a habit born from years of uncertain foraging. When she found the thermos, she struggled with the cap until the wolf nudged her hand with its muzzle, as if offering encouragement. The soup's aroma seemed to transport her somewhere else entirely. Alexander watched her face soften, and for a moment she looked like what she was beneath the wild exterior, a 16-year-old girl who had once known the comfort of warm meals and caring hands. She drank directly from the thermos, sharing sips with the wolf in a gesture so naturally intimate that Alexander felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. When she finished eating, Morag sat back on her heels and studied Alexander with frank curiosity. Her eyes were grey-green, the colour of highland mist, and held an intelligence that seemed both ancient and heartbreakingly young. She tilted her head in a gesture that reminded him of her wolf companion, then reached into the folds of her clothing. What she withdrew made Alexander's breath catch. It was another carving, this one more elaborate than the first. The figure was clearly human, a man sitting alone by a fire, but the expression on the carved face was one of such profound sadness that Alexander felt it like a physical blow. She had been watching him, studying him, understanding his grief in ways that perhaps no civilized person could. Morag placed the carving beside the empty thermos and backed away, never taking her eyes off Alexander's face. He understood this was her gift, her way of acknowledging his kindness while sharing something of herself. The fact that she had seen his pain and chosen to honor it rather than exploit it told him everything he needed to know about the person she remained beneath her wild exterior. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to startle her. She cocked her head again, and Alexander realized this might be the first human speech she had heard directed toward her with kindness in years. He pointed to himself and said, "Alexander." Then, very gently, he pointed toward her and waited. She watched him for a long moment, then touched her chest with one finger. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible, rough from disuse but unmistakably human. "Morag." The simple exchange hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Alexander picked up the carving she had given him, cradling it carefully in his hands, and nodded his acknowledgement. Tomorrow he would return, and perhaps they would find more words to share across the growing trust that connected them. When he looked up again, she was gone, vanished into the forest with her wolf companion, as if they had never been there at all. Only the empty thermos and the precious carving in his hands proved that their encounter had been real. Their daily meetings at the cottage ruins became a ritual that stretched across 2 weeks. Each morning, Alexander would arrive with food and water, and each day Morag would emerge from the forest a little sooner, stay a little longer. She began to show him things, how she tracked the movement of deer through broken twigs, where the sweetest berries grew hidden beneath thorny bushes, which birds sang warnings of approaching storms. Alexander learned to read her moods through gestures that were part human, part wolf. When she was pleased, she would duck her head and make a soft sound in her throat. When uncertain, she would circle at a distance, testing the air for danger that existed beyond the reach of his civilized senses. And when she trusted him enough to come close, she would settle beside him, with the fluid grace of water finding its level. It was on the 14th day that she led him deeper into her world. Morag appeared that morning with unusual energy, pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing, while her wolf companion watched Alexander with what seemed like expectation. When Alexander approached with his customary offerings, she shook her head and gestured toward the forest. She wanted him to follow. The path she chose was invisible to Alexander's eyes, but Morag moved through the undergrowth with absolute certainty. She would pause occasionally to ensure he was keeping up, her expression patient but amused as he stumbled over roots and caught his jacket on low branches. The wolf ranged ahead, appearing and disappearing like smoke among the trees. They climbed steadily for nearly an hour, following what might once have been a deer track but had long since been reclaimed by the forest. Alexander's breathing grew labored in the thin air, but Morag showed no signs of exertion. This was her element, and she moved through it with the unconscious ease of someone who had never learned to fear the wild places of the world. The cave opened before them without warning, a dark mouth in the hillside that was partially concealed by a curtain of hanging vines. Morag paused at the entrance and looked back at Alexander, her expression serious. She touched her chest, then pointed into the darkness. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she was choosing to share it with him. Inside, the cave was larger than Alexander had expected, with natural chambers that extended back into the hill. Morag had made it livable through years of patient work. The main chamber held a fire circle surrounded by flat stones for sitting, while sleeping alcoves had been carved out with animal furs and gathered moss. The walls were decorated with her carvings, hundreds of small figures depicting wolves, deer, birds, and occasionally humans in various poses of daily life. But it was what she showed him in the deepest chamber that made Alexander's hands tremble. She led him to a natural shelf in the rock wall where she had arranged a collection of objects like artifacts in a primitive museum. There were pieces of clothing too small to fit her current size, clearly kept as memories of who she had once been. A child's hairbrush with a few strands of lighter hair still caught in its bristles. A small book of fairy tales, its pages warped by moisture but still readable. And at the center of the collection, a brass key on a length of chain. Morag picked up the key and held it out to Alexander, her eyes grave with an importance he didn't yet understand. When he took it from her, she pointed back toward the direction of the estate, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate something hidden or buried. Alexander examined the key closely. It was old but well made, with intricate engravings along its length. At the base, almost worn away by handling, were the letters E.H., his father's initials. "You want me to find what this opens?" Alexander asked. Morag nodded emphatically, then moved to another part of her collection. She withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellow with age, and handed it to him with reverent care. Alexander unfolded it to find a crude map drawn in what appeared to be charcoal. It showed the layout of the estate's main buildings, but with additional structures marked that Alexander had never seen. One was circled repeatedly, with the key symbol drawn beside it. Understanding dawned slowly. Morag hadn't just survived in the wilderness for 8 years. She had been planning, remembering, preparing for the day when someone might come who could help her reclaim whatever his father had taken from her. The key was more than metal and memory. It was the first piece of a puzzle that would unlock the truth about what had happened at Harrowmoor Estate. Alexander closed his fingers around the key and met Morag's expectant gaze. Whatever secrets his father had buried, whatever had driven this child into the wild, it was time to bring them into the light. He had come to the highlands seeking solitude, but instead he had found a purpose that reached beyond his own grief. Tomorrow they would return to the estate together and begin the work of excavating the past. The cellar beneath Harrowmoor Estate had always been locked during Alexander's childhood visits, dismissed by his father as storage for old wine and hunting equipment. Now standing before the heavy oak door, with Morag's key in his hand, Alexander understood why he had never been allowed to explore below stairs. Morag waited behind him, her wolf companion alert and uneasy in the confines of the estate. She had approached the main house with visible reluctance, stopping frequently to test the air for threats that existed only in memory. When they reached the cellar door, she had pressed the key into Alexander's hand and stepped back, unable to cross that threshold herself. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been recently oiled. The door swung open to reveal stone steps descending into darkness that smelled of chemicals and old fear. Alexander clicked on his flashlight and began the descent, each step taking him deeper into his family's hidden history. The passage ended in a corridor lined with metal doors, each marked with clinical designations: Observation Room A, Medical Storage, Subject Quarters 1-4. Alexander's stomach clenched as he realized he was looking at the remains of his father's research facility. This wasn't a hunting lodge. It was a laboratory designed to study children in isolation. The first door opened onto a room that might have been a classroom if classrooms were equipped with one-way mirrors and recording equipment. Desks sized for children sat in neat rows, but the walls were lined with cameras and speakers. A chalkboard still bore faded equations measuring stress responses and behavioral modifications. Alexander found the research files in what had once been his father's office. Dozens of manila folders filled metal cabinets, each labeled with a number rather than a name. He pulled several at random and spread them across the desk, his flashlight beam revealing documentation that made his hands shake with rage. Subject 23, female, age 8, recently orphaned. Excellent candidate for isolation protocols due to lack of family connections. Beginning standard separation procedures. The clinical language couldn't disguise what Alexander was reading. His father had been experimenting on vulnerable children, studying their responses to deliberate trauma under the guise of therapeutic research. The files documented systematic emotional abuse, dressed up as scientific methodology. He found Morag's file near the back of the cabinet, thicker than the others and marked with red tabs indicating special interest. Her real name appeared nowhere in the documents. She was simply Subject 27, and the notes, tracking her progress through his father's program, painted a picture of deliberate psychological destruction. Day 12, subject continues to resist authority figures. Recommend increasing isolation periods. Day 28, interesting development. Subject has begun responding positively to animal contact while rejecting human interaction. Dr. Whitmore suggests this indicates successful conditioning toward our desired behavioral modifications. Day 45. Subject escaped containment for 6 hours. Found in the forest exhibiting remarkable survival instincts rather than punishment. Recommend encouraging this development as it aligns with our research goals. Page after page documented Morag's transformation from a grieving child into something that could survive alone in the wilderness. Alexander's father hadn't been helping her heal from trauma. He had been deliberately creating it, conditioning her to reject human society in favor of isolation. The final entries were written in his father's own hand, and the clinical tone had given way to something approaching horror. What we have done to this child is unforgivable. She no longer responds to her own name and shows violent fear responses to any adult contact. The committee insists we continue, but I cannot. God help me, I have turned a human child into something feral. The program ends today. I'm destroying all official records and will report that Subject 27 died during a supervised wilderness exercise. She will be listed as a tragic accident, and perhaps that mercy will allow her to disappear completely. I pray she finds peace in the wild, since she will never find it among civilized people again. Alexander closed the file and leaned back in his father's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been done to Morag and the other children who had passed through this place. His father had created monsters, but the real monster had been the program itself. The sound of footsteps on stone made him look up. Morag stood in the doorway, having finally found the courage to enter the place of her torment. Her eyes fell on the open files scattered across the desk, and Alexander saw her recognize the photographs and documents that had once defined her entire world. She moved forward slowly, her fingers trailing across the papers that had reduced her to numbers and observations. When she reached for one particular photograph, a school picture from before her parents' death, her hand trembled like a leaf in wind. Alexander gathered the files carefully and stood. "These belong to you now," he said quietly. "All of it. Every word, every lie, every truth they tried to hide." Morag looked up at him, and for the first time since they had met, he saw tears in her grey-green eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. She was no longer Subject 27. She was Morag Sinclair, and she was finally free to reclaim her stolen past. They spent the next 3 days going through the laboratory together, Morag guiding Alexander through memories that existed in the shadows between what the files recorded and what she had actually experienced. She showed him the observation rooms where she had been watched like a specimen, the small chambers where she had been isolated for days at a time, and the medical facility where Dr. Whitmore had conducted his therapeutic interventions. But it was in the final room, a space the files had labeled simply as personal effects, storage, that they found the key to understanding who Morag had been before his father's program, destroyed her childhood. The room contained dozens of cardboard boxes, each marked with a subject number. Box 27 sat on a high shelf, dusty and forgotten. When Alexander lifted it down and opened it, Morag made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. Inside were the remnants of her life before. School clothes neatly folded, a stuffed rabbit worn soft from years of loving, homework assignments with gold star stickers, and at the very bottom, a small jewelry box containing a silver locket. Morag's hands shook as she opened the locket to reveal two tiny photographs, a man and woman with kind eyes and gentle smiles. Her parents, lost to her for 8 years, suddenly returned through this small act of remembrance. She traced their faces with one finger, and Alexander watched civilization slowly return to her features. "Mama," she whispered, the word rusty but clear. "Papa," the breakthrough came gradually over the following days. Words returned to her in fits and starts, memories surfacing like bubbles, rising through deep water. Alexander learned to read the signs of her struggle. When the human world pressed too close, she would retreat to the forest edge where her wolf waited patiently for her return. But each time she came back a little more present, a little more the girl she had been. They established routines that honored both sides of her nature. Mornings were spent in the estate's kitchen, where Morag slowly relearned the rituals of civilized life, using utensils, sitting in chairs, speaking in full sentences. Afternoons belonged to the wild, where she taught Alexander to see the forest through her eyes, to understand the language of wind and weather that had kept her alive through 8 highland winters. It was during one of these afternoon lessons that Alexander noticed how Morag's touch could calm wounded animals. A red deer with an infected leg had wandered near the cottage ruins, and rather than flee when Morag approached, it had stood still while she cleaned its wound with gentle hands. The sight reminded him of something his late wife Margaret had once said about healing, requiring trust above all else. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the estate's great hall, Morag showed Alexander another treasure from her cave, a photograph that had somehow survived years of wilderness living. It showed a family Christmas scene, with younger versions of her parents flanking a gap where a child should have been. The photograph had been torn, and Morag had been carefully cut out of the picture. "They did this," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Made me disappear from my own life." Alexander studied the torn photograph and felt anger kindle in his chest. His father's research hadn't just isolated Morag from human contact. It had systematically erased her identity, removing every connection to the person she had been before entering the program. No wonder she had lost the ability to trust civilized people. But as he watched her cradle the locket with her parents' pictures, Alexander saw something his father's files had never recorded: Morag's remarkable capacity for healing. 8 years in the wilderness had taught her survival, but underneath that hard-won knowledge remained the loving child her parents had raised. She was not broken beyond repair. She was simply waiting for someone to believe in her restoration. "Your mother was beautiful," Alexander said gently, pointing to the locket's photograph. "You have her eyes?" Morag smiled then, the first true smile he had seen from her. It transformed her entire face, revealing the young woman she was becoming, despite everything that had been done to her. In that moment, Alexander realized his role in her life had shifted from rescuer to witness. Morag was healing herself day by day, choice by choice. He was simply providing the safe space for that healing to occur. Outside, her wolf howled once in the darkness, calling her back to the wild places that had sheltered her when no human could be trusted. But Morag didn't rise to answer. Instead, she curled deeper into the leather chair beside the fire and continued studying the photographs of parents who had loved her unconditionally, remembering what it felt like to be someone's daughter rather than someone's subject. The bridge between her two worlds was growing stronger, built from trust and time and the growing certainty that she was no longer alone. The black sedan arrived on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the highland mist like a shark through still water. Alexander watched from the estate's library window as two figures emerged, a woman in a crisp business suit and a man carrying an official-looking briefcase. He recognized the type immediately. Government officials, social workers, people whose job it was to tidy up loose ends. Morag sensed the danger before the car had even stopped. She appeared at Alexander's shoulder, moving with the silent grace she had never quite lost. Her eyes fixed on the approaching strangers with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Hide," she whispered, the word carrying 8 years of practiced fear, but Alexander shook his head. "No more hiding. We face this together." The woman introduced herself as Ms. Catherine Reed from Social Services, her smile professional and utterly without warmth. Her companion was Mr. James Morrison, a solicitor representing what he termed interested parties in Morag's case. They had come, they explained, because recent inquiries into the Duke's estate had brought certain irregularities to their attention. "Irregularities," Alexander repeated, his voice carefully neutral as they sat in the estate's drawing room. Morag had positioned herself behind his chair, close enough to flee, but present enough to hear her fate being decided by strangers. Ms. Reed consulted her tablet with the efficiency of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Miss Sinclair was declared deceased 8 years ago, following a wilderness accident. Yet we have reason to believe she has been living rough in these hills, without proper care or education. This situation requires immediate intervention. The legal documents Mr. Morrison produced were thick and intimidating, dense with clauses and subsections that amounted to one simple fact: Morag had no legal existence. She was a ghost in the system, which made her vulnerable to whatever arrangements the state deemed appropriate. "There are relatives," Ms. Reed continued, her tone suggesting this was a positive development. "A maternal aunt in Edinburgh has expressed willingness to provide a home. Miss Sinclair will need extensive rehabilitation, of course. Psychological evaluation, medical care, proper schooling to address the educational deficit." Alexander felt Morag's hand touch his shoulder, a silent plea for protection against the well-meaning strangers who spoke of her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. "And if she prefers to remain here?" Alexander asked. "I am her legal guardian now, as specified in my father's will." Mr. Morrison's laugh was politely dismissive. "Your Grace, with respect, your father's legal standing in this matter was compromised by his role in the child's disappearance. The courts will not recognize any guardianship arrangements made under such circumstances. The trap was elegantly constructed. His father's program had created Morag's legal death, which invalidated any documents he might have prepared for her care. She belonged to no one, which meant she belonged to the state." Ms. Reed softened her voice in a way that was probably meant to be comforting. "We understand this is difficult, but Miss Sinclair needs professional help. She's been living like an animal for 8 years. Surely you can see that she requires proper civilization." "Proper civilization," Alexander repeated, the phrase bitter on his tongue. He thought of Morag's gentle hands healing wounded animals, her artwork that captured the soul of wild places, her fierce loyalty to the wolf pack that had kept her alive when proper civilization had failed her completely. "The transport arrangements have been made," Mr. Morrison added, checking his watch. "We can collect Miss Sinclair this afternoon and have her in Edinburgh by evening. The transition will be easier if we move quickly." Alexander stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis. "No," Ms. Reed blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You will not be taking her anywhere today. Or any day." The officials exchanged glances that spoke of difficult cases and uncooperative guardians. Ms. Reed's professional smile returned, harder now and edged with warning. "Your Grace, I appreciate your emotional attachment to this situation, but the law is quite clear. Miss Sinclair is a minor in need of care, and we have the authority to provide that care whether or not you agree." Morag stepped forward then. moving to stand beside Alexander's chair with a dignity that made her wild years seem like a choice rather than a tragedy. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had survived impossible things. "I'm not going with you." The simple statement hung in the room like a declaration of war. Miss Reed's professional composure cracked slightly as she faced the reality of removing an unwilling subject who had spent 8 years learning to disappear at will. "Miss Sinclair," she began, "you don't understand what's best for you." "I understand perfectly," Morag replied. "I understand that you want to cage me the way they did before. But I am not your subject anymore. I am not anyone's subject anymore." Alexander felt pride surge through him as he watched her claim her own agency. This was no longer about his protection or their growing bond. This was about Morag's right to choose her own path forward. The professionals returned the next morning with reinforcements. Alexander counted 6 vehicles winding up the estate drive. Social services, police, medical personnel, and a van marked Specialized Recovery Unit. They had come prepared for resistance, armed with sedatives and legal authority. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the lead vehicle, carrying what Alexander recognized as a tranquilizer gun designed for large animals. The irony was not lost on him. They intended to treat Morag exactly like the wild creature his father's program had forced her to become. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily," Ms. Reed announced as the team assembled in the estate's courtyard. "Miss Sinclair requires immediate professional intervention, and we are prepared to provide it with or without consent." Alexander stood on the front steps, blocking their path to the house. Behind him, he could feel Morag's presence, though she had vanished from sight the moment the vehicles appeared. She was somewhere in the estate's maze of rooms and passages. But he knew it was only a matter of time before their superior numbers and technology tracked her down. "You're making a mistake," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "She's not the feral child you think she is. She's healing, adapting, choosing her own path back to human society." Dr. Chen adjusted the settings on her tranquilizer gun with practiced efficiency. "Your Grace, I've dealt with cases like this before. Extended isolation produces severe psychological damage that manifests as apparent functionality. Miss Sinclair may seem rational to you, but she requires immediate psychiatric intervention." The first police officer started toward the house, and Alexander felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. He could step aside and watch them hunt Morag through the halls of his father's estate, or he could make a stand that would probably end with his own arrest. A low growl rumbled from the forest edge. Every head turned toward the sound as Morag's wolf companion emerged from the tree line, its grey form massive and unmistakably dangerous. Behind it came the rest of the pack, 6 more wolves moving with the coordinated purpose of a military unit. "Jesus Christ," one of the police officers muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. The wolves arranged themselves in a semicircle around the vehicles, not threatening but clearly defining territory. Dr. Chen raised her tranquilizer gun, but Alexander grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he said sharply. "They're protecting her. If you fire on them, you'll turn this into a bloodbath." That was when Morag appeared. She emerged from the forest like something from a highland legend, moving between her wolves with fluid grace that made the assembled professionals step back involuntarily. She wore her wild clothing like armor, and her grey-green eyes held an authority that spoke of someone who had learned to command respect from creatures that answered to no human law. "You want me?" she called across the courtyard, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Then come and take me." What followed was a standoff that revealed the futility of trying to capture someone who had spent 8 years learning to disappear. Every time the recovery team moved toward her, Morag simply melted back into the forest, leaving them to face her wolf pack's yellow-eyed stare. The tranquilizer gun was useless against a target that refused to remain stationary, and the police were reluctant to pursue her into terrain where she held every advantage. After 2 hours of fruitless maneuvering, Ms. Reed called for a tactical retreat. But as the vehicles prepared to leave, she delivered a warning that chilled Alexander's blood. "This isn't over," she told him as she climbed into her sedan. "We'll return with proper equipment and personnel. Thermal imaging, professional trackers, helicopter support if necessary. Miss Sinclair can run, but she cannot hide indefinitely." Alexander watched the convoy disappear down the estate drive, then turned to find Morag emerging from the forest with her pack flanking her like a royal guard. But instead of victory in her expression, he saw something that worried him more: the cold calculation of someone preparing for war. "They'll be back," she said simply, "with better hunters." "Then we'll be ready for them," Alexander replied, though he had no idea what form that readiness might take. Morag studied his face for a long moment, then nodded toward the forest. "Come, if you're going to help me fight them, you need to learn what I know." That afternoon, she began teaching him the skills that had kept her alive for 8 years: how to move through the forest without leaving tracks, where to find water that wouldn't show up on satellite imagery, which caves could shelter them through a highland winter. Alexander understood he was being prepared for the possibility that they would both need to vanish completely. The hunt for Morag Sinclair was about to begin in earnest, and this time the stakes were not just her freedom, but her very survival. They left the estate before dawn on the 3rd day, carrying only what they could fit in hiking packs. Alexander had spent the previous evening burning his father's research files in the great hall fireplace, watching 8 years of documented cruelty dissolve into ash and smoke. Whatever happened next, that evidence would never be used to justify further harm to Morag or any other child. The forest felt different with Morag as his guide. Where Alexander saw impenetrable wilderness, she read pathways written in the language of deer trails and water flow. She moved with the unconscious confidence of someone who belonged completely to this landscape, pausing occasionally to show him signs he would never have noticed: a broken branch that indicated the passage of other humans, a change in bird calls that warned of approaching helicopters. They climbed steadily through the morning, following ridgelines that kept them above the mist and away from the valleys where thermal imaging would be most effective. Morag's wolf pack ranged around them in a protective formation, invisible until needed but always present. Alexander began to understand how she had evaded capture for so long. She wasn't hiding from civilization so much as existing in a parallel world that operated by different rules. By midday, they reached what Morag called the sanctuary, a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by some ancient glacier. The space was perfectly concealed from above by an overhang of stone, while a clear spring provided fresh water and the forest canopy offered complete protection from aerial surveillance. It was here, she told him, that she had planned to make her final stand if the authorities ever came for her. "How long have you known this place?" Alexander asked as they made camp in the shelter of the stone walls. Morag arranged her belongings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved camp countless times. "I found it the first winter. I was dying, and Storm brought me here." She gestured toward the grey wolf who had become her constant companion. "The pack raised me, but this place saved me." Alexander studied the natural fortress with new appreciation. Strategic sight lines, multiple escape routes, defensible positions. Morag had been thinking like a military commander since she was 8 years old, because survival had demanded nothing less. That evening, as they sat beside a carefully concealed fire, Morag showed him the stone that had given the place its name. Set into the wall at the back of the amphitheater was a carved compass rose, weathered by centuries but still clearly visible. The markings were Celtic in origin, far older than any modern settlement in the highlands. "The old ones knew this place was special," Morag said, tracing the carved lines with one finger. "They marked it as a sanctuary for those who needed protection from the world below." Alexander touched the ancient stone and felt a connection to something larger than their immediate crisis. This wasn't just about Morag's freedom or his own desire to protect her. They were part of an older story, one that had been playing out in these mountains for generations. The conflict between those who would cage the wild and those who understood that some things were meant to remain free. The helicopter found them on the second day. Alexander woke to the distant thrum of rotor blades, echoing off the mountain peaks. Morag was already alert, her pack positioned for immediate departure. She listened to the sound with the focused intensity of a prey animal assessing a predator. Military grade, she said quietly. Thermal imaging, probably night vision capable. They're serious this time. The aircraft passed overhead without stopping, but Alexander knew it would be back with ground teams and tracking equipment. Their sanctuary had bought them time, but not safety. We have two choices, Morag told him as they watched the helicopter disappear toward the horizon. We can go deeper into the mountains, keep running until winter forces them to give up. Or we can end this. Alexander heard something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. End it how? Morag pulled something from her pack that made his heart stop. It was a newspaper clipping, recent and carefully preserved, with a headline that read, "Government Committee Investigates Historical Child Welfare Abuses." "While you were sleeping, I made a trip to the village," she said. "Mrs. Duncan at the post office let me use her computer. There are others, Alexander. Other children who went through programs like your father's, other families demanding answers." She spread additional clippings across the stone floor of their sanctuary. Headlines about government inquiries, parliamentary questions, survivor testimony. A scandal was building, and Morag had been quietly documenting every development. If I surrender now, if I tell my story publicly, it becomes evidence, not just of what happened to me, but of a systematic pattern of abuse. Her grey-green eyes met his with fierce determination. They want to silence me by putting me in their system. But I'm not that frightened child anymore. I'm a witness, and I have a story to tell. Alexander understood then what she was proposing. Not surrender, but testimony. Not hiding, but exposure of the truth that powerful people had worked for years to keep buried. The compass rose on the wall, seemed to pulse with ancient approval, marking this place as a sanctuary where the hunted could finally turn and face their hunters. The druid stones stood in their ancient circle at the highest point of the ridge, weathered sentinels that had watched over the highlands for 3,000 years. Morag led Alexander to this sacred place in the pre-dawn darkness, moving by starlight and memory through terrain that would have been impossible for him to navigate alone. She had never brought anyone here before. This was her most secret sanctuary, the place where she came when the weight of her wild life became too heavy to bear. The stone circle sat in a natural clearing, perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions and positioned to catch the first light of dawn. Even in the darkness, Alexander could feel the power of this ancient place, the accumulated weight of centuries of prayer and ritual. The old druids used this place for ceremonies of transformation, Morag said as they settled against the central stone. When someone needed to die to their old life and be reborn as something new. Around them, her wolf pack arranged themselves in a protective circle, their eyes gleaming like amber stars in the darkness. Alexander had grown comfortable with their presence over the past weeks, learning to read their moods and body language, understanding that they viewed him as part of Morag's extended family. "Is that what you're planning?" Alexander asked gently. "A transformation?" Morag pulled her knees to her chest and stared up at the stars. "I've been thinking about what it means to be human. Your father's program tried to turn me into an animal, and for 8 years I survived by becoming exactly that. But sitting here, in this place where people have been seeking wisdom for thousands of years, I realized they never really succeeded." She stood and walked to one of the standing stones, placing her palm against its rough surface. "I learned to hunt and track and live without shelter. I learned to speak the language of wolves and read the weather in cloud formations. But I also learned compassion from caring for wounded animals. I learned patience from waiting through winter storms. I learned loyalty from my pack family." Alexander watched her move between the ancient stones, her wild clothing and tangled hair making her seem like a figure from Celtic legend. But her words were entirely human, thoughtful and measured in a way that would have impressed any philosopher. "The people who are hunting me think wildness and civilization are opposites," she continued. "They believe you must choose one or the other. But this place teaches something different. The Druids understood that wisdom comes from embracing both sides of our nature." The first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose. Morag positioned herself at the center of the stone circle and closed her eyes, her face turned toward the coming light. Around them, the forest began to wake with the calls of birds and the rustle of small creatures beginning their daily search for food. "I want to tell you about the night I escaped," Morag said quietly. "The night your father's program finally broke something in me that couldn't be repaired." Alexander held his breath, understanding that she was about to share something she had never spoken aloud. Dr. Whitmore had been escalating the isolation protocols. 3 days without food, locked in a cell no bigger than a closet. They wanted to measure how long it would take before I begged for human contact. Her voice remained steady, but Alexander could see her hands trembling. "On the 3rd night I stopped being Morag Sinclair. Something wild took over, something that knew how to slip locks and move in darkness and find the weakness in any cage. The sun crested the horizon, sending shafts of golden light between the standing stones. The illumination transformed the sacred space, making the weathered granite seem to glow from within. I ran into the forest with no plan except to never let them cage me again. But when I found the wolf pack that first winter, when Storm accepted me as part of his family, I discovered something your father never understood." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Alexander. "Wildness isn't the absence of civilization. It's the foundation civilization is built on." The light had reached the central stone where Alexander sat, warming his face and hands. He understood now why Morag had brought him to this place. She wasn't just preparing to face her hunters. She was preparing to teach them something about the nature of humanity itself. "When I walk down from this mountain," she said, "I won't be the feral child they expect to capture. I'll be someone who has learned to bridge 2 worlds, someone who can speak for all the children they tried to break." She smiled, and in the morning light she looked like a young goddess delivering prophecy. They wanted to study what happens when you strip away civilization from a human being. Instead, they created someone who understands what civilization really means. The Druid stones witnessed her transformation from victim to teacher, their ancient wisdom blessing her journey from the wild back to the world of human law and justice. They descended from the sacred stones as the morning mist began to lift, carrying with them a sense of purpose that felt as ancient as the Druid circle itself. But as they approached the tree line, Alexander felt the weight of what lay ahead settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. In a few hours, Morag would walk back into the world that had broken her, trusting that this time would be different. She seemed to sense his uncertainty, pausing on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the distant valley where civilization waited. Her wolf pack gathered around them, their amber eyes reflecting the morning light as they watched their human family prepare for separation. "You're afraid," Morag observed, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone she used to comment on weather patterns or animal behavior. Alexander nodded, seeing no point in denying what she could read as easily as tracks in snow. "I'm afraid they'll find a way to silence you. I'm afraid the system will protect itself by destroying the evidence you represent." Morag reached into her pack and withdrew something that made Alexander's heart constrict with recognition. It was his wedding ring, the simple gold band he had removed at Margaret's graveside and thought he had left behind at the estate. Somehow, during their hasty departure, she had thought to retrieve it. "You told me about her," Morag said gently, holding the ring up to catch the morning light. "About how losing her made you want to disappear from the world entirely. About how grief felt like drowning in an ocean with no shore in sight." Alexander accepted the ring from her hands, his fingers closing around the warm metal. He had spoken of Margaret during their long evenings by the fire. sharing memories with someone who understood what it meant to lose everything that defined you. But you didn't disappear, Morag continued. You came to the highlands looking for solitude, and instead you found me. You could have walked away when the officials came. You could have let them take me and returned to your comfortable life in London. I couldn't, Alexander said simply. You needed protection. No. Morag shook her head, smiling with the wisdom of someone who had learned to see clearly through years of solitude. I needed a witness, someone who could understand both worlds, who could stand between the wild and the civilized and translate between them. She gestured toward the valley below, where the first threads of smoke were rising from village chimneys. Margaret taught you how to love completely, how to build a life with someone who understood your heart. But losing her taught you something else, how to let go of everything you thought you needed in order to find what you actually needed. Alexander felt tears sting his eyes as he understood what she was telling him. His journey to Harrowmoor hadn't been an escape from grief, but a path through it, leading him to a purpose he never could have imagined while Margaret was alive. I'm not the broken child who ran into these mountains 8 years ago, Morag said, her voice gaining strength with each word. And you're not the man who arrived here drowning in sorrow. We found each other because we both needed to learn the same lesson. Sometimes the only way to heal is to help someone else heal. She stood and called to her wolves, her voice carrying the complex harmonies she had learned during her years as part of their pack. They gathered around her, pressing close for what they seemed to understand was a farewell. Alexander watched her say goodbye to the family that had raised her, each wolf receiving individual attention and what appeared to be specific instructions for their survival without her. When she turned back to Alexander, she was no longer the wild girl he had first glimpsed running through the heather. She was Morag Sinclair, survivor and witness, ready to reclaim her place in the human world while carrying the wisdom the wild had taught her. The ring, she said, nodding toward the gold band in his hands. Put it back on. I can't, Alexander protested. Margaret is gone. Margaret is part of you forever, Morag replied firmly. Just like the wild will always be part of me, even when I'm sitting in courtrooms and speaking to reporters. We don't abandon the loves that shaped us. We carry them forward and let them give us strength for what comes next. Alexander slipped the wedding ring back onto his finger, feeling its familiar weight settle into place. Margaret's love didn't feel like a burden anymore, but like a blessing that had prepared him for this moment. This choice to stand with someone who needed an advocate in the world below. Together, they walked down from the mountains toward whatever waited in the valley, carrying 8 years of wilderness wisdom back to the civilization that had tried so hard to break the spirit of a child. But that child was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood exactly what she was worth, and exactly what she intended to do about it. They reached the estate as the afternoon shadows were growing long, expecting to find it surrounded by the forces that had been hunting Morag for days. Instead, they found something far more ominous, a single black Range Rover parked in the courtyard, its windows tinted dark as midnight. Alexander felt Morag tense beside him as they approached through the forest edge. This wasn't the chaotic presence of social workers and police they had evaded in the mountains. This was something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. The man who emerged from the vehicle was tall and expensively dressed, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of serious power wielded quietly. He smiled as he saw them, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Your Grace," he called across the courtyard. "Miss Sinclair, I was hoping we might have a civilized conversation." Alexander recognized the type immediately. Government oversight, the kind of official who appeared when situations needed to be managed rather than solved. He positioned himself slightly in front of Morag, though he knew the gesture was largely symbolic. "And you are?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying the authority of generations of noble breeding. Sir Edmund Blackwood, Cabinet Office. "I handle sensitive matters that require discretion," The man's smile widened slightly. "I believe you've been causing quite a stir with your little adventure in the wilderness." From his jacket pocket, Sir Edmund withdrew a manila folder that he opened with theatrical precision. "Miss Sinclair, we have been most impressed with your resilience. 8 years surviving in conditions that would break most adults. Quite remarkable, really." Alexander felt his father's rifle, retrieved from the estate's gunroom, pressing against his shoulder where he had slung it before their descent from the mountains. The weapon was loaded and ready, though he prayed he wouldn't need to use it. "However," Sir Edmund continued, "we find ourselves in a delicate position. The research program you experienced was part of a classified government initiative. Information about its methods and findings falls under the Official Secrets Act." Morag stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. "You're saying I'm not allowed to tell my own story? I'm saying that certain aspects of your experience involve matters of national security. We understand you've been in contact with journalists, Miss Sinclair. We understand you believe you have evidence of wrongdoing." Sir Edmund's voice hardened slightly. "Those documents and files belong to Her Majesty's government. Removing them from a secure facility constitutes theft of classified materials." Alexander felt the trap closing around them. They had burned the files, but admitting that would only confirm their guilt in Sir Edmund's carefully constructed legal framework. On the other hand, now the official continued, "we are prepared to be quite generous. A substantial settlement, private medical care, a new identity if you prefer. All we require is your signature on a confidentiality agreement and your cooperation in retrieving any materials you may have taken from the estate." The offer hung in the air like poison. Alexander could see the calculation behind it. Easier to buy Morag's silence than to risk the scandal her testimony might create. A comfortable prison in exchange for her voice. "And if I refuse?" Morag asked quietly. Sir Edmund's smile disappeared entirely. "Then I'm afraid you'll find yourself facing charges of theft, trespassing, and violation of the Official Secrets Act. The courts tend to be quite harsh with cases involving national security. You could be looking at 20 years in prison." Alexander felt rage building in his chest, but before he could speak, Morag laughed. The sound was wild and free, carrying echoes of wind through highland peaks and wolf songs under starlit skies. "You still don't understand," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "You think you can threaten me with cages? I've spent 8 years learning that freedom isn't something you can take away from someone who understands what it really means." She reached into her pack and withdrew something that made Sir Edmund's face go pale. It was a small digital recorder, the kind journalists used for interviews. "While you were explaining how you planned to silence me," Morag said calmly, "I was recording every word, including your admission that a classified government program experimented on children and your attempt to bribe a witness to prevent her from testifying about it." Sir Edmund's composure cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, girl. Forces far beyond your comprehension." Alexander stepped forward then, his father's rifle sliding from his shoulder into his hands with practiced ease. He didn't point it at Sir Edmund, but the threat was unmistakable. "I think this conversation is over," Alexander said quietly. "Miss Sinclair has made her position clear." The official looked between them, calculating odds and consequences. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold fury of someone accustomed to getting his way. "This isn't finished. Not by a long way." As the Range Rover disappeared down the estate drive, Alexander realized they had just declared war on people who commanded resources far beyond anything they could imagine. The real battle for Morag's freedom was only beginning. They came at dawn, as Alexander had known they would. Not the bumbling social workers and local police of previous attempts, but professional soldiers moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Through the estate's windows, Alexander counted at least 20 figures in tactical gear surrounding the building, their movements barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Morag stood beside him in the great hall, her wolf pack arranged around her like living shadows. Storm, The great grey alpha who had claimed her as pack family 8 years ago, wore something Alexander had never seen before, a collar of braided leather and metal that marked him as leader of their wild alliance. "They've brought tranquilizer guns?" Morag observed calmly, watching the tactical team position themselves at all possible exits. "Military grade, effective on large predators. They're planning to take the wolves alive for study." Alexander felt his grip tighten on his father's rifle. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was preparing to defend a girl who had survived his own family's cruelty. But looking at Morag now, seeing the quiet strength she had built from years of surviving the impossible, he knew he would rather die than let them cage her again. "How do we play this?" he asked, deferring to her superior knowledge of tactics and survival. Morag moved to the great fireplace and withdrew something from behind the stone mantel. A signal horn carved from antler, its surface inscribed with Celtic symbols that seemed to pulse in the firelight. When she raised it to her lips and blew, the sound that emerged was primal and haunting, carrying across the highland valleys like the voice of the mountains themselves. From the forest came answering calls. Not just wolf howls, but the cries of red deer, the screams of golden eagles, the deep bellowing of highland cattle. Every wild creature within miles of the estate was responding to Morag's summons, gathering for a battle that would determine whether the wild places of Scotland would bow to government, authority. The first soldier through the front door found himself facing not a cowering child but a young woman who moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Morag's hand struck his wrist with surgical precision, sending his tranquilizer gun spinning across the stone floor. Before he could react, Storm was there, his massive form driving the intruder back through the doorway. Alexander fired a warning shot into the air, the rifle's report echoing through the hall like thunder. "The next one goes center mass," he shouted toward the tactical team. "Miss Sinclair is under my protection, and I will not allow her to be taken." What followed was unlike any battle Alexander could have imagined. The wolves moved through the estate like smoke, appearing and disappearing through passages they had mapped during weeks of preparation. Morag seemed to be everywhere at once, her knowledge of the building's layout allowing her to strike and vanish before the soldiers could coordinate their response. But it was what happened outside that truly turned the tide. The highland wildlife that had answered Morag's call began their own assault on the tactical vehicles. Red deer stags, their antlers like branching spears, charged the equipment trailers. Golden eagles dove at the soldiers' heads, their talons aimed at exposed skin and communication equipment. Even the highland cattle, normally placid creatures, formed a living barrier across the estate's access road. The professional soldiers found themselves fighting not just human opponents, but the entire ecosystem of the Scottish Highlands. Commanded by a girl who spoke its ancient language, through the chaos, Alexander glimpsed Morag moving with Storm toward the estate's rear entrance. She caught his eye and nodded toward the forest, indicating her plan to lead the wolves to safety while the animals created cover for their escape. But as she reached the doorway, a tranquilizer dart caught her in the shoulder. Alexander watched her stumble, fighting the drug's effects through sheer force of will. Storm howled in rage and positioned himself between Morag and her attackers, his massive form bristling with protective fury. The alpha wolf's collar seemed to glow in the morning light as he faced down armed soldiers with nothing but loyalty and courage. "Go!" Morag gasped, reaching for Storm's collar as her vision began to blur. "Lead them home." The great wolf seemed to understand. He threw back his head and howled once more, a sound that carried grief and defiance in equal measure. Then he gathered the pack and melted into the forest, following orders given by the human who had earned their absolute trust. Alexander fired again, this time aiming for the soldier who had darted Morag. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Around the estate, the Wild Alliance began to withdraw, their mission accomplished. They had saved the wolves, even if they couldn't save their human pack leader. As the tranquilizer took full effect and Morag collapsed, Alexander made his own choice. He dropped the rifle and moved to shield her unconscious form with his own body, knowing that her real battle would begin when she woke up in whatever facility they planned to take her to. The wild had taught her to fight. Now it was time to see what civilization could learn from her example. 6 months later, Harrowmoor Estate had been transformed into something its previous inhabitants could never have imagined. The old hunting lodge now served as a sanctuary for children who had fallen through the cracks of the social services system. Young people who needed space to heal away from the institutions that had failed them. Morag stood in what had once been her father's laboratory, now converted into an art studio where troubled teenagers learned to express their trauma through painting and sculpture. The clinical white walls had been painted over with murals depicting highland landscapes and wild creatures, created by young artists who were learning to trust their own voices again. The Westminster Committee has agreed to expand the investigation, Alexander announced as he entered the studio, carrying a letter bearing official parliamentary seals. They want you to testify before a full public inquiry into historical abuse in government-funded programs. Morag smiled as she cleaned paint from her hands, the simple domesticity of the gesture still surprising her sometimes. She had spent the winter learning to navigate the civilized world again, but on her own terms. The sanctuary they had created honored both sides of her nature, structured enough to function within society's expectations, wild enough to nurture the spirits of children who had been broken by too much structure. "How many?" she asked, referring to the other survivors who had come forward since her story broke in the national press. 47 confirmed cases across 6 different facilities, Alexander replied, his voice heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. "And those are just the ones brave enough to speak publicly." Through the studio windows, Morag could see some of their current residents working in the garden she had designed, using permaculture principles learned during her wilderness years. 15-year-old Jamie, who had spent 3 years bouncing between foster homes, was teaching younger children how to read soil composition. Sarah, barely 13, and recovered from a residential facility that had nearly destroyed her sense of self-worth, was cultivating healing herbs with the focused attention of someone who understood the value of growing things. The sanctuary operated on principles that conventional social work had never attempted. Children arrived traumatized and defensive, expecting another institution that would try to reshape them according to some bureaucratic ideal. Instead, they found adults who had learned hard-won lessons about the relationship between freedom and healing. "Storm came by again today," Morag mentioned, gesturing toward the forest edge where her old pack leader occasionally appeared to check on his former human daughter. "He brought the new cubs. I think he's teaching them that humans can be trusted, at least the right kind of humans." Alexander followed her gaze and smiled. The wolves had become an integral part of the sanctuary's healing process, though they maintained their wild independence. Children who had been failed by human caregivers often found their first steps toward trust through carefully supervised contact with creatures who understood. Survival and loyalty in their purest forms. The evening meal was served family-style in the Great Hall, where the mounted deer heads had been replaced with photographs documenting the children's progress and achievements. Morag took her place at the head of the long table, a position that would have seemed impossible during her years as Subject 27. Now she was simply Morag, guardian and teacher, someone who had learned to bridge the gap between civilization and wildness. "Tell us about the mountains," requested Lucy, a 10-year-old who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier, still flinching whenever adults moved too quickly around her. This had become a nightly ritual. Stories of survival and adaptation that helped the children understand they weren't broken, just temporarily lost. Morag spoke of winter storms weathered in hidden caves, of learning to read the mood of weather in cloud formations, of the patient kindness of animals who had taught her what family really meant. as she talked. She noticed Alexander quietly placing packets of seeds around the table, morning glories, wildflowers, vegetables that would grow in highland soil. Tomorrow, the children would plant them, adding their own choices to the gardens that surrounded their sanctuary. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Morag and Alexander sat by the fire in his study, planning expansion of their programs. Letters arrived daily from other survivors wanting to visit, from social workers seeking training in their methods, from government officials who were finally beginning to understand that healing required trust rather than control. "Do you ever miss it?" Alexander asked quietly. "The complete freedom of the wild?" Morag considered the question, listening to the sounds of the house settling around them, the quiet breathing of sleeping children, the whisper of wind through trees that had witnessed both cruelty and redemption, the distant howl of wolves who knew they were welcome here. "I never left the wild," she said finally. "I just learned to bring it with me into the civilized world. The wildness isn't in the location, Alexander. It's in the courage to be authentically yourself, no matter what anyone else expects you to become." Through the window, the highland night stretched endlessly toward the mountains, holding space for all the lost children who might someday find their way home. 2 years after her testimony brought down Sir Edmund Blackwood's network and led to the largest government inquiry into child welfare abuses in British history, Morag Sinclair sat at the same oak desk where her father had once written his clinical observations about broken children. But the journal she kept now told a very different story. "Day 847 since the sanctuary opened," she wrote in her careful handwriting. Young Marcus spoke his first full sentence. "Today, the wolves understand me," he said, watching storms pack through the window. Sometimes the simplest truths carry the most power. The morning sun slanted through windows that no longer held the shadows of institutional cruelty, illuminating pages filled with observations about healing rather than harm. Morag had learned to document hope with the same precision her father had once used to catalogue despair. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his hair showing more grey than it had during their first desperate flight into the mountains, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of work that honoured Margaret's memory through service to others. "The Edinburgh delegation is here," he announced. "They want to discuss replicating our model in facilities across Scotland." Morag closed her journal and stood, smoothing the simple dress she wore for official meetings. She had learned to navigate the world of committees and government funding, though she still preferred bare feet when policy allowed and kept a window open in every room, regardless of weather. In the great hall, she found a dozen officials in their customary dark suits. But these were different from the hunters who had once pursued her. These were allies, people who had witnessed what happened when children were given space to heal according to their own nature rather than institutional expectations. Dr. Sarah MacLeod, Scotland's new Minister for Child Welfare, rose as Morag entered. She was a woman who had spent years fighting the same systemic failures that had created Subject 27, and her appointment had been one of the first reforms to emerge from the parliamentary inquiry. "Miss Sinclair," Dr. MacLeod said, "we've completed our evaluation of the Harrowmoor model. In 2 years, you've achieved recovery rates that exceed anything we've seen in traditional facilities." Morag took her place at the head of the table, a position that still sometimes surprised her with its normality. Around the room, she saw faces that reflected genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment she had learned to recognize during her years as a research subject. "The difference," Morag said, "is that we don't try to fix the children. We give them space to remember who they were before the world broke them. And then we help them choose who they want to become." She gestured toward the windows, where several of their residents could be seen working with Storm's pack in the carefully designed interaction, areas that allowed supervised contact between traumatized children and the wolves who had taught Morag about unconditional acceptance. Traditional therapy assumes that Wildness and civilization are opposites, she continued. But the children who come to us have usually been damaged by too much civilization, too many rules designed to make them manageable rather than healthy. They need to reconnect with something more fundamental before they can trust human institutions again. Dr. MacLeod leaned forward, her expression intent. And the wolves are essential to this process. The wolves are teachers, Morag explained. They demonstrate loyalty without expectation, protection without control, acceptance without judgment. For children who have been betrayed by human caregivers, sometimes the path back to trusting people leads through trusting creatures who can't lie or manipulate. Alexander added quietly, we've documented remarkable improvements in children who were previously considered untreatable. The combination of structured support and access to authentic wildness seems to address trauma in ways that traditional methods can't reach. As the meeting continued, Morag found herself thinking about the journal entry she would write that evening. The officials were discussing funding and expansion, replication and standardization, all the necessary mechanics of bringing healing to more children. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. She was no longer the only bridge between the wild and civilized worlds. When the delegation departed that afternoon, promising resources and support for expansion of their programs, Morag walked to the forest edge, where Storm waited with his newest cubs. The great wolf had grown grayer over the years, but his yellow eyes remained as sharp as ever, watching over both his wild family and the human pack that had learned to speak his language. Look what we built, Morag told him, gesturing toward the sanctuary that had risen from the ashes of her father's failed experiments. Look how many children will never have to run to the mountains to find safety. Storm's rumbled response seemed to carry approval. And as evening fell over the highlands, Morag returned to her journal with a final entry. Day 847. Today I understood that my real purpose was never to choose between wild and civilized, but to prove they could coexist. Every child who learns to trust again, every official who changes policy based on what we've demonstrated here, every wolf who accepts a frightened human into their understanding of family, they are all evidence that healing is possible when we stop trying to cage the spirits that make us most truly alive. The mountains taught me to survive, but civilization is teaching me to thrive. And in that balance I have finally found home.